Greetings, listeners. Welcome to our next episode of Refugee Voices. And today we have a humanitarian leader from um, Refugee and Immigrant Solidarity and Education of San Francisco, Angelina Romano. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Angelina Romano, she, her, they, them. I'm a school social worker for San Francisco Unified School District and the district coordinator for RISE SF, our Refugee and Immigrant Solidarity and Education program. Happy to be here with you guys.
Yeah, thank you for joining the show. So, just to start off, you can give a brief background of yours and how you're involved in the community of refugees and immigrants.
Yeah. So, it falling into the world of refugee and immigrants kind of happened a little by accident and a little because I speak Spanish. So I went to, before I got my master's in social work, most of my social service work had been working in shelters with young people. So youth shelters in Oakland, in New York. Um, and that's kind of where I even did my master's thesis on homeless young people or unhoused young people. And then by virtue of speaking Spanish, my second internship was at a school site, and they were about to open wellness centers at a school called Newcomer High School in San Francisco, which no longer exists, but it was a school. It was a 1 year transitional program for newly arrived immigrants from all over the world, predominantly Chinese speakers, but about 30% was Spanish speakers. So once I graduated, I became a wellness coordinator at San Francisco Unified, and I opened the wellness center at Newcomer High School that didn't have a wellness center. At San Francisco Unified, now all of our high schools, back then it wasn't all of them, but all of our high schools have wellness centers with a social worker, a nurse, and what's called a community health outreach worker and a therapist, at least half-time therapist, half-time nurse. So I opened the wellness center at Newcomer High School and there for about 3 years. And then Newcomer High School closed. And then I opened the wellness center at the sort of new iteration of that school, the San Francisco International High School, which is part of an internationals network of high schools that started out of New York, I believe in Queens. So that's sort of how that got started in my work with young people, immigrant and refugees. And that was the first time, I think, especially working with our Spanish speakers, the first time I'd ever heard of a young person crossing Central America and through Mexico by themselves and getting to the border on their own. I'd never really heard of that before. Or young people riding on the tops of freight trains. I'd never heard of that before. My idea of a migrant during those times was adult men, right, coming to the United States to work. I didn't really have this idea of young people fleeing violence, abuse, neglect, trying to reunify with a caregiver or relative here in the United States. I'd never heard of that before. And I'd never heard of our Chinese young people or other folks not from the continental Americas coming here to reunify or what they are like what they would call themselves parachute migrants, meaning that they weren't reunifying with family. They were just kind of being dropped off with sometimes like business partners or family friends in order to be able to go to school and eventually work. Yeah. So that's how I sort of got started and started learning about that life and had to do a lot of my own learning, research, watching documentaries, reading books, like trying to find as much as I could. And at the time, especially with unaccompanied minors, there wasn't a lot of research and studies on this topic. Now
Mhm.
there's so much, you can find it anywhere. But at the time, unaccompanied minor literally meant like a young person getting on a plane by themselves. Like that's all people thought of when they thought of that sort of category. That's all it meant to them.
Right. And I think it's really important that you mentioned the southern border because we hear a lot about it, especially in the news and in politics, but a lot of people don't know exactly what it's like. And as someone who witnesses what happens firsthand, I think you can provide like a lot of insight. Um, right now, as of 2024, how is the situation going with that? And is the majority of refugees or migrants that you help coming from the southern border or from international countries, from other countries?
Yeah. So I should also say that when I was starting the wellness programs at the high schools, that was until about 2012. And then I did some other work outside of the district. And then in 2014, there was the surge, as they called it, of unaccompanied minors crossing our southern border, primarily Spanish speakers. And when that happened, the city released some money in order to support unaccompanied minors getting legal services. Because as it stands, because seeking asylum is not a crime, you are not guaranteed an attorney, right? Like if I commit a crime, I get an attorney, but if I come ask for asylum, I'm not guaranteed an attorney. So even though you are being actively deported, um, you have to pay for your own attorney, and that can usually be around $7,000. There are pro bono or free attorneys, but depending on the number of asylum seekers, they can really be at capacity. So in 2014, there was some funding that was released for the city, and some legal partners created collaborations to try and make sure that unaccompanied minors were being represented in court. So San Francisco Unified, I founded a program called Caminos, which was specifically for Spanish speaking. Caminos means like journeys or pathways. For Spanish speaking, newly arrived refugee and immigrant students, uh, with a focus on unaccompanied minors, but not just them. And the goal of Caminos was to help school sites do better in supporting these new arrivals, right? To like learn how to create inclusive and equitable programming at your schools, how to make sure that things were multicultural, all that kind of stuff. And then also to partner with our legal organizations to ensure that our young people were getting connected to attorneys for court, and that we were orienting young people and families to legal immigration
Right.
proceedings. So Caminos, after the Trump election in 2016, expanded to become Rise. So we weren't just focused on Spanish speaking new arrivals, but we started focusing on all refugee and immigrant young people and families, not just our newcomers, but also enhancing our sanctuary education at school, adherence to sanctuary policy, and also recognizing, right, that some of our refugee and immigrants have been here for a very long time. They're not just newcomers. So trying to ensure that we are being inclusive of the whole spectrum and holistic community of refugee and immigrants at SFUSD. Currently, so we only see refugees and immigrants who have crossed the border if they're enrolling a young person in school, right? So what we see is a narrow view because we don't see single adults, right? I don't have any contact with single adults. It's only if they have young people in school or adults that are coming who already have young people in school, but I might not know anything about, oh, and their dad just arrived. I might not hear about that, right?
Right.
Um, but so in terms of new arrivals, what we are seeing right now is a huge shift. So when I first started in the district, the majority of our new arrivals were from China. That slowly started changing, especially in 2014, but especially during COVID. Our Chinese numbers dropped significantly. And while there was a big increase in violence in Central America, what we call the Northern Triangle, our migration from, and also it used to be predominantly Mexican migrants as well, or refugees, but that had also decreased. And what started coming up during those years, 2014, was El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala because of the level of state violence, imperialism, colonialism, all of that area has experienced. We saw a lot of refugees coming from there. And after the pandemic, then the Chinese newcomer numbers were dropping, and now because of changes in South America that they're experiencing, we're also seeing a huge increase in Colombian, Venezuelan, Peruvian, Nicaraguan, which is Central America, not South America. But there's been a huge shift in who we're seeing crossing by land. And we're also seeing, though I haven't had encounters with this community as much, but I know that it's happening. Chinese refugees flying into South America and then crossing the border by land, which is something we'd never seen before. Or also a lot of migrants coming from the Caribbean, from other places, even from countries in continental Africa, and making the journey by land, which is really new.
Right. And I feel like the border is a huge thing that's on a lot of people's minds right now, especially with the upcoming election.
Mm.
A lot of people are talking about like mass deportations, because they say a lot of these people are criminals or come from mental asylums. Could you shed some light on that? What percentage of these refugees or migrants are an issue for people living in the U.S., and are they is a mass deportation a good idea in your opinion?
I mean, well, I think obviously no. In my, uh, yeah, I think that it's a very uncomplicated issue. But then when all these little sort of racist, xenophobic um, talking points arise, and it seems like it's a lot more complicated, but it's not. So I feel like we have a moral imperative to take care of each other, to recognize all of our humanity. I think that all the things around criminality and what have you is just racism and xenophobia, and also trying to use scare tactics as a way of increasing political engagement. Um, yeah, I don't think that there's any research at all that shows that any one group is particularly more criminal than another group ever. And criminal, what does that even mean? How are we defining that? Who gets to be a criminal? Who gets to avoid that label? Is all based on like race and class. Who has more exposure to the police? Who is more, you know, um, all
Right.
those things. So, uh, yeah, I think what for me is actually the most difficult is this idea of borders in the first place, and migration as a human right for those who need to survive, and who are, especially minors and young people in general, who are trying to flee adult problems, problem in an adultist world where the problems that you're having are primarily adult made, and you have no voice in the solutions of those problems. So then you're forced to flee for your life, and go into debt to try and get to the United States, and then have to deal with the carceral state when you're being detained and traumatized in detention facilities, maybe separated by your family. And then you have to go to court and pay for an attorney, and you're not allowed to work, but you still have to go to school. Like, these are the things I wish we could focus on, is how to find our humanity, and recognize people's, international right to cross borders and seek refuge in countries. Um, yeah, and right now the border is a mess because everyone keeps responding to a current political situation. So under Obama, they created what was called the rocket docket. So starting to expedite removal for minors. So all of a sudden, young people were coming in and they had court dates like right away. Meanwhile, there were young people who had been here for 4 years that hadn't had court dates at all. And so their court dates got pushed back. Their asylum cases got pushed back. And then the ones who were just arriving got expedited. But then Trump came in, and then he made a different decision about things. So then there was more backlog and more complications. And now we have CBP1, which is great because then folks have are able to get their work authorization. But then it just gets, everything is so confused, and there's such a huge backlog in asylum cases. Like, I have young people and families that have been here for years and haven't had court, don't know what's happening, like nothing moves. And then I have young people like today, there's two minors who have their second court already. They came here on their own and their parents are not here. They're living with a relative and they're already on their second court date. And they just got here like less than a year ago. So there's like no rhyme or reason. It's completely disorganized and it's really frustrating and inhumane. Um, so if we could fix that in different ways, which to me, of course, as a strong advocate and abolitionist, would be what's the word? Amnesty for everybody,
Right, of
especially
course.
for young people who have already been here for so long.
Mhm. Since you did work with minors and they come with different needs and different ways to need support, basically, become compared to all the other
Mm-hmm.
refugees, perhaps internationally, crossing the
Mm-hmm.
border and everything is a large process and also a mental toll on the minors. So, how do you guys
Yeah.
approach them when they come to you seeking help? And also just the process of them kind of assimilating with the new culture and also the new environment around them.
Yeah. So what we do at Rise is we've tried to focus in the last like couple of years our work on our on SFUSD's enrollment center, right? So all families we have a centralized enrollment, so you come to one place to enroll your young person in a school. So we have what's called the newcomer station, which is basically just a desk, um, where hopefully families who are enrolling their young person, if we recognize them as newcomers, that they can come and talk to us. I usually try to remember that engagement and trust and to remind our school site starts with, or let me say it this way, networking, whether it's with a client or like a colleague, is about what you offer people, right?
Mhm.
It's not about what they can give you, it's about what you're able to give them. So being able to offer new arrivals something really tangible and helpful helps to build trust and for them to recognize that you kind of know what they're going through, right?
Mhm.
And that you aren't going to be surprised, that you aren't going to be overwhelmed by whatever they present to you, trauma or what have you. So giving them backpacks, offering them bus tokens to get on the bus, helping explain how to get on the bus, what you need to get on the bus, how you pay for it, right? Or using Google Maps to explain parking, permits, meters. Doing a lot of the basic orientation helps a lot to build rapport. And then to be able to just name things, right? Like I had a young person, two young people yesterday, or sorry, like last week, elementary aged, who crossed the border, not by land, but they were reunifying with mom and dad, who they hadn't seen in a very very long time. Um, and I said to them like, "Oh, that can be really really hard, huh? Do you miss home?" And mom jumped in and was like, "They're really happy to be here." And I'm like, "No, I'm sure that they are really happy to be here. And it can get really complicated, like you can feel more than one thing at once, right? You can be really happy to be here and then have a lot of grief for not being in your home country and wishing that, your whole family could just be together and be somewhere safe and that you didn't all have to be in separate places struggling, right? Just to survive. So I think I start with that sort of little building rapport and acknowledging some things that might be happening for them or that I've noticed happen with other young people and families, and maybe that'll happen for you. So I think I've lost a little track of what your original question was, but so that's how we sort of help start building rapport with young people and families. But you had other questions around, I think, acculturation, maybe you mentioned.
Just like how, I mean, you pretty much answered it, but just how
Mm.
how you guys work with them to get them more assimilated into the new environment,
Mm.
because
Yeah.
obviously they come from various different places. So I'm sure each of them have different needs when they come to you.
Yeah. So, what research has shown time and again is that the more a young person or even an adult who's migrated somewhere can maintain a balance and a connection to their country of origin and their language of origin and the new country and new language, the better their outcomes will be. So, for young people, the more they're able to keep that balance, the more likely they are to attend school, graduate, right, the less likely they are to engage in risky behaviors, whether substance use or sexual risk-taking behaviors. So we try to focus more on the idea of acculturation versus assimilation. Assimilation means more that you're like becoming fully part of the new culture, right? Like maybe you forget your language or not practicing your customs anymore. Acculturation is about maintaining that balance. And we do want young people and families to integrate into the culture here and not feel like fully apart either, like refusing, like, I'm not going to learn English. I don't want to be here. I'm going to go back. Like, that's not healthy either. So finding a place where you're building peer social networks, where you're remembering the things you used to do that brought you joy in your country, where you're no longer having this sort of honeymoon idea of what it means to be in the United States, right? When you have a more realistic idea of what it means to be here, when you're able to like tap into some of the feelings that you're having of loss, regret, sadness, right? Trying to heal from the trauma you've experienced and being more open about what you've experienced. So that's what we try and encourage our school sites, or like what we try and educate our school site staff so that they can do that work with young people, and recognizing that acculturation is not a linear process, right? Like young people and families move all over the place in their acculturation process, right? From like not wanting anything to do with being here to then like, oh, okay, I'm going to join a skateboarding club, and then like backtracking again, right? Like it goes all over the place, and it for like the entire time you live here, probably. Like I always kind of make the joke that my grandma was still like in culture shock for like all of her 30-40 years that she was here, right? And not learning English, um, all of that. So each person has their own process, definitely related to their context, and all of the variables and resources that they have in their life, or they don't have, I guess.
Right. I really liked how you talked about not just assimilating, but sort of maintaining both your roots. And not just for refugees, even for like people like me involved, second generation immigrants, it's sometimes hard to like draw a parallel between our Indian roots and our now American roots. One
100%.
thing Yeah, and one thing I wanted to ask you was in what way can like the broader population, day-to-day individuals, people who don't really, their job is not to work with refugees, but in what way can they contribute just a little bit? Because I think one thing that me and Volib learned is just if everyone just does like 1% more, it can
Mm,
make a huge difference.
yeah. I mean, I always think about, and like you said, right? Like some of the things that apply to refugee and immigrant well-being apply to all of us. Yeah. Like when you said that, what I often think about and talk about in like trainings that I might do for school staff is to think about our Black American young people and families, right? And the idea of your home culture and the culture in the outside world, that often there's a tension there and you're not always included or thought of. It's not always the spaces that are made for you, and actually sometimes are spaces that are made to be explicitly violent towards you, right? Like even the idea of code switching, yeah, and having to like go to school and like, you know, be different in order to survive and to make sure that you can get ahead, right, and get your needs met. And I do think in folks in like whatever workplace, family, or school that you're at, thinking about equity, inclusion, anti-racism, thinking about how you can be courageous in standing up for these things when things might come up, or to be the voice of multiculturalism all the time. I find myself always having to be the one who's like, is this going to be translated? Are we going to have interpreters available? Are we thinking about folks who cannot read or write? How are we going to be able to communicate to those folks, right? Or not to make assumptions about communities and recognizing that they're not monoliths. So, like, not all Spanish speakers are Mexican. Not all folks from Asia are Chinese. You know, like not all Black folks were born here. Like it's just like being able to remember the complications in our humanity and hold that with you everywhere you go. and to really be brave in how you approach like those little, right? The little incremental changes in your everyday, I think, can
Right.
lead to a lot of huge changes. And it's something that even if you're not that resourced, let's say economically or something, is something that you can still probably do. And for those that are more resourced, I would think about donating your time, or housing a refugee. There are plenty of programs where you can sponsor a refugee. You can go to school sites and see if they need more fundraising, even simple things like backpacks, bus passes. There are all sorts of little ways that you can help that make a huge difference, for a lot of our communities that are struggling.
Mhm. And you worked with so many um, people from, you said 2001 when you came to San Francisco, and I'm sure there's been people that you've connected with more. And do you mind sharing any impact stories, like successful stories from these refugees or migrants, from their difficult journeys to where they have become today?
I mean, yes, and San Francisco is such a small city, also, and the Bay is such a small, or Bay Area is such a small area that I see a lot of young people that I've worked with in the past.
Mhm.
I wouldn't suggest that my work with them is the reason why they are successful. And it is beautiful to see young people. You run into young people, even since my time, not at school sites, but like when I was 20 something in 2001 working at a youth shelter, and seeing young people now that are now 20 something and being able to tell them, I was your age when I was helping you get housing, and seeing that they're doing well, and have kids and are still working. It's a beautiful thing. I think the most impactful for me, and it is not a young person. I had some contact with them, and their success is their own, who I witnessed from an unaccompanied minor who is now a colleague of mine, working in another district, doing the same sort of parallel work with other unaccompanied minors. Like, that is arriving here at 14 on their own and seeing them become a colleague, I mean, is a beautiful thing. Another young person that I worked with at a school, at one of the new arrival high schools, and then now is a school counselor at that same school. It's, I mean, those stories are phenomenal, and I do think that the majority of our young people, their stories are successes, whether or not they graduate high school, whether or not, um, they fully learned English, whatever kind of job slash career they have, whether or not they go on to college. Like, it's important to remember that the immigrant narrative, especially, and for those of us, who are born here, maybe our parents were immigrants, our grandparents were immigrants, like, remembering that a lot of the immigrant narrative is that first person that came, with a few dollars, came on their own, came when they were young people, and their whole vision is for their future generation of family, right? Their whole hope is to support their current family and the ones that come next. And just being here and surviving and thriving is a success, right?
Right, I think that's a very beautiful thing that you said. Me and Volab, we went to Greece in a refugee camp over the summer, and sort of seeing the way that we were making an impact, and we were able to feed over 50 families for a month, and seeing like how happy they were, I guess the smallest things. It was the real payment, even though obviously we didn't get paid for it. That was more satisfying than any amount of money we could have received. So I think that was a very beautiful thing that you said. Just to One thing that I was sort of wondering was, as there are many youth nonprofits that are sort of arising in the United States, not just on refugees, but on various social problems like mental health or the homeless crisis.
Hmm.
And for me and Balav, for Open Arms, we are always wondering, for successful nonprofits like yours, what advice do you have for youth-led nonprofits that don't really have, that many resources,
Hmm.
that many connections, that much time either?
Sure, sure.
How can we make a tangible difference?
Yeah. Well, so first I want to say that I'm not a nonprofit. I'm a city county, so I'm part of the San Francisco Unified School District. So I'm not a 501c3 nonprofit. A city and county agency, and coming from a city where resources are not equitably distributed, right? So like even now, our district is facing huge financial crisis because our values don't always align with the amount of money that we have, right? So we have a lot of social services and maybe we don't have the funding to match that. So we're in a bit of a, situation at the moment. And building a program that wasn't always fully funded. I think what I've learned is to engage in a diversity of tactics, and that your biggest asset is networking and finding people who are committed to this, or like that it's their heart work, or being able to make it people's heart work, right? Like for them to build a love for the humanity, or like for building their own humanity and community, just like you guys had that feeling in Greece, like learning how to like get people to connect to that feeling and how important it is for them to feel the connection in the community, right? um, and just finding allies or accomplices who are willing to join in. And it doesn't always have to be contributing money, like it can just be contributing services. And I've often felt like I plant little seeds everywhere I go, and I don't have to be there to watch it blossom, but then I see it and I'm like, oh, great, yeah, that worked out. And they're doing all sorts of things now. Like we have these support groups called Fuerte, which means strong in Spanish. And it's these support groups that happen at school sites for newly arrived Spanish speaking migrants. And that came about through during the surge in 2014, these pediatricians at University of California, San Francisco reached out to me and were like, hey, we'd like to help. What do you need? We want to do some. And I was like, you know what we could really use help with is starting groups. And then it just like snowballed year after year, and now now it's like I forget how many millions of dollars state funded grant to run these groups across school sites. It's just become like a beautiful thing, and I barely have anything to do with it anymore at all. Like it just like has taken off. So I do think sometimes you have to think about grassroots and just starting small and letting it build, and a little bit of top down, right? Like you don't always have to go to the big funders and things, but it does help to go to the state, the city, the county level, and from the ground up. And then hopefully you meet somewhere in the middle.
So, for a refugee or a migrant to find your work and your services, do they just have to attend the school and do they find out, or what's
Yeah.
the process for them to find out about your services and also like reach out and contact you guys?
I think that so most of our student facing work happens at the enrollment center. So when they come to enroll a young person, hopefully the counselor that they work with at the enrollment center will connect them to us if they are new arrivals. Otherwise, I would say for young people to connect to their school support staff. In San Francisco, our schools are built to be supportive entities with social workers and nurses, like I mentioned before. So for a young person and or their caregiver to really build a relationship with the school site, I think is the most important. And then I help the school site staff, right? So I think that's my primary relationship of interest is between the school site and the family. Yeah. And then I will help the school site do the work with the family, if that makes sense. I don't
Mhm.
really need them to find me. I want them to engage with their educational process at school. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And is there any new recent initiatives or projects that you've undertaken,
Mm.
you or one of whoever you work with in your programs?
Mm. Yeah, so we recently were working with our partners at the Justice and Diversity Center,
Mhm.
which is a part of the Bar Association of San Francisco. We've always been working with them since 2014. in connecting young people and families to attorneys. However, last year we were partnered with them for them to get a grant from the Crankstart Foundation to support our students in getting connected to legal services. So we just got, it's a $1 million grant, 500 over 2 years. So 500,000 over 2 years to ensure that we're serving, I think it's at least 400 students. So whether it's them getting Know Your Rights workshops or orientation to services, and some what they call limited scope services, which is like little applications that you have to file in like court proceedings, or to like full scope representation in court. And I think this is like the first of its kind, this kind of like really well funded legal educational partnership. So we're really, really excited about that.
It's lovely. Nice to hear.
Yeah, thanks.
And that sounds awesome, Angelina. And just to top it off, is there any final message that you'd like to say to our viewers?
I think it's wonderful that you're listening and that you all are trying to sort of uplift and center the voices of refugees and what their needs are. And I just hope that, everyone can, more than anything, just recognize our shared humanity, right? And don't buy in or get sucked into the divisive rhetoric. I think the majority of us have big hearts and want to be in community with each other. And just remember that I think that we are the majority, and to just keep building with each other.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Angelina, for coming on to our podcast, Refugee Voices. Your insights on the southern border and the trauma crisis and what your organization has done, and many of the other firsthand experiences that you've had have not only been very informative, but also inspiring. And I think this was a great episode for our viewers at home. And once again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all. I appreciate your time.
And we appreciate yours.